While the rest of America was watching the Barcelona Olympics and debating presidential candidates, 600 of the entertainment industry's most powerful people were gathering at a private mansion in Mendham Township for what would become one of the most talked-about weddings of the decade. Whitney Houston, the woman whose voice had defined an entire generation, was about to marry Bobby Brown, the bad boy of R&B who had captured her heart in ways that confused everyone who knew her. Among the exclusive guest lists that included Dionne Warwick, Patti LaBelle, Gloria Estefan, and Stevie Wonder was a real estate mogul from New York who would later become one of the most controversial figures in American politics. Donald Trump arrived that evening wearing purple, just like everyone else had been instructed to do. Purple was Whitney's favorite color, and she had made it clear that her wedding would be a celebration drenched in royal violet. But as Trump walked through the elaborately decorated mansion, observing the extravagant floral arrangements and the carefully choreographed celebration, something about the entire atmosphere made him deeply uncomfortable in ways he wouldn't fully articulate until years later. The relationship between Donald Trump and Whitney Houston stretched back to 1989, when they first met at a charity event at Trump Plaza Hotel in Atlantic City. Whitney had performed at Trump's venues multiple times during the peak of her career, and Trump had always spoken about her with genuine admiration. He called her voice the greatest he had ever heard, and unlike many of his celebrity relationships that were purely transactional, Trump seemed to genuinely like Whitney as a person. He had watched her rise to unprecedented heights in the music industry, breaking barriers and setting records that seemed impossible to match. The Whitney Houston he knew in the late 80s was confident, powerful, and completely in control of her destiny. She was America's sweetheart, the girl with the golden voice who could do no wrong. But something had changed in the 3 years between their Atlantic City meetings and this wedding day. The wedding itself was a spectacle of contradictions. On the surface, everything appeared perfect. The mansion was transformed into a purple paradise with thousands of flowers in various shades of violet cascading from every surface. A gospel choir filled the air with spiritual music that brought many guests to tears. Whitney wore a custom-designed gown that cost more than most people's houses, and when she walked down the aisle, her beauty was so overwhelming that several guests later described the moment as seeing an angel descend to earth. Bobby Brown, dressed in a purple tuxedo that somehow managed to look both elegant and rebellious, waited at the altar with an expression that mixed genuine love with something darker that few people recognized in the moment. The ceremony was intimate despite the crowd, with only 150 people allowed into the actual wedding service, while the other 450 guests waited for the reception that would follow. Donald Trump watched the ceremony from his seat among the other celebrity guests, and those who sat near him later recalled that he seemed distracted throughout the vows. He wasn't rude or disengaged, but there was a quality of concern in his expression that stood out among the general atmosphere of celebration. Trump had built his career on reading people, on understanding the subtle dynamics of power and weakness in business negotiations, and those same instincts were firing warning signals throughout the ceremony. The way Bobby Brown carried himself with an aggressive confidence that seemed to challenge rather than compliment Whitney's grace. The way Whitney's smile, though beautiful, seemed to require effort rather than flowing naturally from joy. The way certain members of Whitney's family exchanged glances that spoke of reservations they couldn't voice on such a public occasion. Trump noticed all of it, filing away observations that would later crystallize into a conviction he would express years afterward when tragedy had already struck. The reception that followed the ceremony was even more elaborate than the wedding itself. 600 guests moved into a massive tent that had been erected on the mansion grounds, decorated with purple fabric that created the illusion of being inside a royal pavilion. The entertainment was world-class with performances by several of Whitney's famous friends. The food was catered by one of New York's most exclusive restaurants. The champagne flowed endlessly, and the celebration lasted well into the early morning hours. But beneath the surface of celebration, careful observers noticed tensions that hinted at troubles to come. Bobby Brown's friends and Whitney's friends formed separate clusters that rarely mixed comfortably. There were moments when Bobby's behavior became loud and aggressive in ways that seemed to embarrass Whitney even as she laughed along. Trump spent much of the reception in conversation with other business figures who had been invited, but he also spent significant time observing the bride and groom from a distance, watching how they interacted when they thought no one important was looking. What most of the 600 guests didn't know as they celebrated into the night was that the wedding almost didn't happen at all. In the weeks leading up to July 18th, Whitney had experienced several moments of doubt about marrying Bobby Brown. Her mother, Whitney Houston, had been vocally opposed to the union from the beginning. Sissy had watched Bobby's career trajectory and his public reputation and saw nothing but danger for her daughter. She had tried multiple times to convince Whitney to call off the wedding, but Whitney was in love in a way that made her deaf to warnings. Dionne Warwick, Whitney's cousin and a woman who had navigated the music industry's dangers for decades, had also expressed serious reservations. But Whitney was 28 years old, at the absolute peak of her fame and power, and convinced that her love for Bobby Brown was strong enough to overcome any obstacle. She had spent her entire life being America's perfect princess, the good girl who never made mistakes, and Bobby represented something wild and free that she craved even if she couldn't fully articulate why. Donald Trump's concerns about the marriage went beyond simple disapproval of Bobby Brown's reputation. Trump had seen enough of Whitney during her performances at his Atlantic City properties to recognize that she was someone who thrived on structure, discipline, and the high standards that had made her successful. Bobby Brown represented chaos and spontaneity in ways that seemed exciting but fundamentally incompatible with the kind of life Whitney had built. During the reception, Trump had a brief conversation with Clive Davis, the legendary music producer who had discovered Whitney and guided her career to unprecedented heights. Davis shared Trump's concerns, but felt powerless to intervene. Whitney was an adult making her own choices, and any attempt to stop the wedding would have been seen as controlling and paternalistic. Trump and Davis stood together watching Whitney and Bobby dance, and Davis later recalled that Trump said something that stuck with him for years. He said he hoped he was wrong, but he had a feeling this marriage was going to cost Whitney more than anyone realized. Davis remembered feeling a chill despite the warm summer night. The contrast between Whitney's world and Bobby's world was visible throughout the reception in ways that made perceptive guests uncomfortable. Whitney's friends and family represented the elite of Black American success stories. These were people who had fought their way to the top of their respective fields through extraordinary talent and ironclad discipline. They dressed impeccably, spoke eloquently, and carried themselves with a dignity born from having to be twice as good to get half as far in industries that weren't always welcoming. Bobby's crew, while certainly successful in their own right, represented a different aesthetic and philosophy. They were louder, more street, more willing to push boundaries in ways that Whitney's circle found concerning. This wasn't about one group being better than another, but about fundamental incompatibility in how they approached life and success. Whitney had spent years carefully cultivating an image of respectability that had opened doors for countless Black artists after her. Bobby seemed almost allergic to that kind of image management, preferring authenticity even when it meant courting controversy. Trump spent a significant portion of the evening in conversation with other real estate and entertainment moguls who had been invited to the wedding. During these conversations, he couldn't help but return repeatedly to his observations about the bride and groom. One guest who spoke to Trump extensively that night later revealed that Trump kept coming back to the same theme. Whitney was too talented and too important to risk her career on a relationship that seemed destined for trouble. This wasn't Trump being judgmental about Bobby Brown as a person, but rather Trump applying his businessman's instinct for assessing risk. He had seen too many talented people destroy themselves through bad partnerships, and every indicator he could observe suggested that this marriage fell into that category. Trump's date for the evening found his preoccupation with the couple's dynamics somewhat obsessive, but Trump couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching the beginning of a tragedy in real time. There was a moment during the reception that several guests later pointed to as encapsulating the entire dynamic that would define Whitney and Bobby's marriage. A DJ was playing a mix of Whitney's hits and Bobby's hits, and when one of Bobby's more sexually explicit songs came on, Whitney visibly cringed. It wasn't that she was prudish, But there was a clear discomfort with that version of musical expression in such a public setting with her family and industry colleagues present. Bobby, reading her discomfort, responded not by being considerate, but by getting more animated, dancing more provocatively, seemingly determined to prove that he wouldn't change who he was for anyone, not even his new bride. Whitney laughed it off, but the laughter looked forced to those paying attention. Trump, watching from across the tent, turned to a companion and made a comment that was remembered years later when his prediction proved tragically accurate. He said that Whitney was trying to be someone she wasn't, and Bobby was refusing to be anyone he wasn't, and that fundamental mismatch was going to end badly. The musical performances at Whitney Houston's wedding reception were extraordinary by any standard. Patti LaBelle, one of the greatest voices in soul music history, sang a gospel number that had the entire tent on their feet with tears streaming down their faces. Stevie Wonder performed a specially written song for the couple that spoke about eternal love and commitment. Gloria Estefan brought Latin flair to the celebration with a performance that had everyone dancing. And of course, Whitney herself couldn't resist taking the microphone at one point, delivering an impromptu performance of her hit song, "I Will Always Love You," that left every single person in attendance breathless with the sheer power and beauty of her voice. Donald Trump, who had heard Whitney sing many times before, was once again struck by the almost supernatural quality of her talent. He later described that moment as both beautiful and heartbreaking, because he could see in her eyes that she was trying to convince herself that this marriage was the right decision. Bobby Brown also performed during the reception, and his performance revealed the stark differences in their artistic approaches. While Whitney's music was about technical perfection and emotional depth delivered with almost classical precision, Bobby's performance was raw energy and street authenticity. He worked the crowd into a frenzy with his hit, "My Prerogative," a song that was essentially about refusing to conform to anyone else's expectations. The lyrics seemed to be sending a message not just to the audience, but to Whitney herself and to everyone who had doubted their relationship. Bobby was declaring that he would do things his way regardless of what society or the music industry or Whitney's family thought. The crowd went wild, but Trump noticed that many of Whitney's closest friends and family members looked uncomfortable during the performance. The contrast between Whitney's heartfelt ballad and Bobby's defiant anthem couldn't have been more obvious, and it painted a picture of two very different people trying to build a life together. As the night wore on and alcohol continued to flow, the carefully maintained facade of perfect celebration began to crack in subtle ways. There were several small confrontations between members of Bobby's entourage and Whitney's family that had to be quietly diffused by security. Nothing serious enough to ruin the party, but enough to create an undercurrent of tension that perceptive guests couldn't ignore. Trump witnessed one such incident when one of Bobby's friends made a crude comment about Whitney that was overheard by Whitney's brother Michael. Michael confronted the man, and for a moment it looked like the situation might escalate into physical violence before cooler heads intervened. Trump, who had dealt with countless conflicts in his business dealings and his casino operations, recognized the incident as a warning sign of deeper incompatibilities between the two families and the two worlds they represented. During the later hours of the reception, Trump found himself in a small group conversation that included Clive Davis and Dionne Warwick. The three of them stood somewhat apart from the main celebration, and the conversation turned serious as they discussed their concerns about Whitney's future. Dionne was particularly emotional, expressing her fear that Whitney was making a terrible mistake, but feeling powerless to stop it. She spoke about how Whitney had changed over the past year, becoming more defensive and more isolated from the people who had always looked out for her best interests. Clive Davis added his own observations about how Whitney's focus on her music had become less sharp, how she was missing recording sessions, and showing up unprepared in ways that were completely unlike her previous professionalism. Trump listened more than he spoke, but when he did contribute to the conversation, he emphasized his belief that Bobby Brown was going to be a destructive influence on Whitney's career and possibly her life. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the main table where Whitney and Bobby were seated. Bobby had become noticeably intoxicated and was being loud in ways that were drawing negative attention. Whitney was trying to calm him down while maintaining her smile for the benefit of the guests, and the photographers who were documenting every moment. Several of Bobby's friends joined in his rowdy behavior, turning what should have been an elegant celebration into something that felt more like a nightclub scene. Trump watched the situation unfold and saw Whitney's expression shift from patient understanding to barely concealed frustration to resigned acceptance, all in the space of a few minutes. It was in that moment that Trump became absolutely convinced that this marriage was doomed. He had seen that same progression of emotions in business partners who were trapped in bad deals, that same realization that they had made a mistake, but felt too committed to back out. As the reception finally began to wind down in the early morning hours, guests started saying their goodbyes to the bride and groom. Donald Trump waited until the crowd had thinned considerably before approaching Whitney and Bobby to offer his congratulations and best wishes. The interaction was brief but revealing. Whitney, exhausted from the long day and the emotional roller coaster, seemed genuinely grateful for Trump's presence and his long-standing support of her career. She hugged him warmly and thanked him for coming all the way from New York. Bobby, still riding high on adrenaline and alcohol, gave Trump a perfunctory handshake and immediately turned his attention elsewhere. Trump wished them both happiness and success, but as he walked away from the couple, he turned back for one last look at Whitney. She was standing alone for a moment, Bobby having been pulled away by friends, and in her face Trump saw something that confirmed all his worst fears. She looked lost, uncertain, and already regretting choices that she felt she could no longer undo. The problems that Donald Trump and others had predicted began almost immediately after the wedding. Whitney and Bobby's honeymoon was cut short due to Bobby's legal troubles stemming from past incidents. Within months, there were rumors of domestic disputes and wild behavior that contradicted the fairy tale image Whitney had tried to present to the world. The music industry insiders who had attended the wedding and shared Trump's concerns watched with increasing alarm as Whitney's behavior began to change in disturbing ways. She started missing promotional appearances for her albums. Her performances became erratic, sometimes brilliant, but other times noticeably off in ways that suggested substance use. The woman who had been known for her absolute professionalism and dedication to her craft was becoming unreliable, and everyone who cared about her knew exactly why. Trump, who had remained in occasional contact with Whitney through their mutual connections in the entertainment industry, heard stories that deeply troubled him. Whitney had begun using drugs, something that would have been unthinkable during her earlier career. The influence of Bobby Brown's lifestyle and his own well-documented substance abuse issues had pulled Whitney into a world that was completely at odds with everything she had built. Trump later revealed that he had tried to reach out to Whitney through intermediaries during this period, hoping to offer support or assistance, but she had become isolated from many of her old friends and supporters. The people around her now were enablers rather than advocates, more interested in maintaining access to her money and fame than in protecting her well-being. Trump recognized this pattern from his experiences in Atlantic City, where he had seen countless talented people destroy themselves because the people who should have protected them failed in their duty. By the late 1990s, Whitney Houston's decline was no longer a private matter but a very public spectacle. Her physical appearance changed dramatically as drugs took their toll on her once flawless beauty. Her voice, that incredible instrument that Trump and millions of others had considered the greatest of all time, began to deteriorate. Performances that should have been triumphant became painful to watch as Whitney struggled to hit notes that had once come effortlessly. The media, which had built her up as America's princess, now seemed to take perverse pleasure in documenting her fall. Every arrest, every bizarre public appearance, every piece of evidence of her crumbling marriage became tabloid fodder. Trump watched this public destruction from a distance, feeling a mixture of sadness and frustration. He had seen the warning signs at that wedding in 1992, and now he was watching his predictions come true in the worst possible way. The relationship between Whitney and Bobby descended into a toxic cycle of breakups and reconciliations that played out in the media for over a decade. There were arrests for drug possession, allegations of domestic violence, and increasingly bizarre behavior from both parties. Whitney's family, who had warned her against the marriage from the beginning, found themselves largely shut out of her life. Cissy Houston made multiple attempts to stage interventions, but Whitney was defensive and resistant to help. The girl who had grown up singing in church and had been raised with strong values had become someone almost unrecognizable, and her mother's heartbreak was visible to anyone who saw her during those years. Donald Trump's name would later be connected to one of these intervention attempts, a story that wouldn't become public until years after Whitney's death. Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown officially divorced in 2007, ending 15 years of marriage that had been marked by more pain than joy. For those who loved Whitney, including people like Trump who had watched her career with admiration, the divorce offered hope that she might finally turn her life around. Free from Bobby's influence, perhaps Whitney could reclaim her voice, her career, and her dignity. There were initial signs that this hope might be justified. Whitney entered rehab, seemed committed to sobriety, and began talking about a comeback. She released a new album in 2009 that, while not matching the success of her earlier work, showed glimpses of her old brilliance. She booked a tour and appeared on several high-profile television interviews where she spoke candidly about her struggles and her determination to rebuild her life. But the damage had been done. Years of drug abuse had permanently affected Whitney's voice and her health. The comeback never fully materialized in the way her fans hoped. Performances were inconsistent, with good nights becoming rarer and painful struggles becoming more common. Trump, watching from afar, felt vindicated in his early assessment but took no satisfaction from being right. He had wanted to be wrong about the wedding, had hoped that somehow Whitney and Bobby would prove all the doubters mistaken and build a successful life together. Instead, he had watched exactly what he predicted unfold over 15 years, and the woman whose talent he had so admired had been diminished in ways that no amount of rehabilitation could fully reverse. Trump later said in interviews that Whitney's story was one of the saddest he had witnessed in his decades of knowing celebrities and entertainers. February 11, 2012. The news broke that stunned the world. Whitney Houston had been found dead in a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Los Angeles. She was only 48 years old. The official cause of death was drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. The woman who had sold over 200 million records, who had inspired a generation with her voice, who had broken barriers for Black artists, was gone. The music world went into mourning, with tributes pouring in from every corner of the entertainment industry. But for those who had been at her wedding 20 years earlier and had seen the warning signs, there was also a terrible sense of inevitability. This tragedy had been building for 2 decades, and everyone who had tried to warn Whitney or help her felt the weight of failure. Donald Trump was asked to comment on Whitney's death by multiple media outlets. His response was measured but emotional in ways that surprised some people who didn't know about his long history with the singer. Trump called Whitney a friend and described her voice as the greatest he had ever heard. He said her death was a tragedy that didn't have to happen, and he specifically blamed Bobby Brown and others in Whitney's circle for failing to protect her. Trump's comments were blunt in a way that some found inappropriate so soon after her death, but they reflected genuine anger and frustration. He had seen this coming at that purple-themed wedding in 1992, had watched it unfold over 2 decades, and now the worst possible outcome had occurred. Trump was invited to Whitney's funeral and considered attending, but ultimately decided that his presence might create unwanted media attention that would distract from honoring Whitney's memory. In the years following Whitney Houston's death, Donald Trump spoke about her several times in interviews, always with a tone of genuine sadness and regret. He never claimed to have been close personal friends with Whitney, but he was honest about having known her, admired her, and worried about her. Trump's most extensive comments about Whitney came during his 2012 interviews, when the pain of her death was still fresh. He talked about watching her perform at his Atlantic City properties during her peak years, and being absolutely mesmerized by her talent. He spoke about the wedding and how even in that moment of celebration, he had felt uneasy about the path Whitney was choosing. Trump's assessment was harsh but honest. Bobby Brown had been bad for Whitney Houston. The marriage had destroyed her career and ultimately contributed to her death, and everyone who had warned her had been proven tragically correct. Some people criticized Trump for speaking ill of Bobby Brown so soon after Whitney's death, arguing that it was disrespectful to blame one person for another's choices. Bobby Brown himself was devastated by Whitney's death despite their troubled history, and many felt that Trump's comments were unnecessarily cruel. But Trump defended his right to speak the truth as he saw it, arguing that pretending Bobby hadn't been a destructive influence on Whitney's life was dishonest and disrespectful to her memory. Trump pointed out that Whitney's decline had coincided almost exactly with her relationship with Bobby, that her drug use had started during their marriage, and that everyone in Whitney's life who truly cared about her had opposed the union from the beginning. These were uncomfortable facts that some people preferred not to acknowledge, but Trump believed that learning from Whitney's tragedy required honesty about what had gone wrong. Whitney Houston's story resonated with Trump on a level beyond just personal sadness, because it fit into a pattern he had observed throughout his decades in business and entertainment. He had seen countless talented people destroy themselves through bad relationships, poor choices, and negative influences. Trump had watched his own brother, Fred Trump Jr., die from alcoholism at age 43, a tragedy that had profoundly affected the entire Trump family. Trump had sworn after his brother's death that he would never drink alcohol himself, and he had been vigilant about recognizing the signs of self-destruction in others. When he looked at Whitney Houston's trajectory, he saw his brother's story reflected back. He saw talent squandered, potential wasted, and a life cut tragically short because the person couldn't or wouldn't escape from destructive influences. In the years after Whitney's death, as Trump transitioned from business and entertainment into politics, he occasionally referenced her story as a cautionary tale. During speeches about drug addiction and the opioid crisis, Trump sometimes mentioned Whitney as an example of how substance abuse destroys lives regardless of wealth or fame. He spoke about the importance of having strong people around you who will tell you hard truths rather than yes men who enable destructive behavior. Trump's political opponents sometimes accused him of exploiting Whitney's memory for political purposes, but those who had been there at the wedding in 1992 and remembered Trump's early concerns understood that his interest in Whitney's fate had always been genuine, even if his public comments were sometimes tactless or self-serving. One of the most haunting aspects of Whitney Houston's tragedy was contemplating what her life and career might have been if she had made different choices. At the time of her wedding to Bobby Brown, Whitney was at an unprecedented peak. She had already achieved success that most artists could only dream of, but she was still young enough and talented enough that her best work could have been ahead of her. If Whitney had married someone supportive who encouraged her talent rather than someone who pulled her into darkness, she might have continued making groundbreaking music for decades. She might have transitioned into producing and mentoring younger artists. She might have become a mogul in her own right, using her platform and success to build something even larger. Instead, 15 years of marriage to Bobby Brown had been followed by only 5 years of freedom before her death. Far too little time to undo the damage that had been done. Donald Trump's observation at the wedding that Whitney was making a mistake that would cost her everything had proven tragically accurate. The purple dream of July 18, 1992, had become a nightmare that ended in a bathtub in Beverly Hills 20 years later. Trump, reflecting on this in interviews, acknowledged that he had no power to change Whitney's choices and that ultimately every adult is responsible for their own decisions. But he also maintained that the people around Whitney, including Bobby Brown, bore responsibility for enabling and encouraging her worst impulses rather than protecting her best interests. Trump's critics accused him of Monday morning quarterbacking and being judgmental, but those who had witnessed the same warning signs he had at that wedding understood that his concerns had been real and prescient. Despite the tragedy of her personal life and the sadness of her early death, Whitney Houston's musical legacy remains untouchable. Her recordings continue to inspire new generations of singers who study her technique and try to capture even a fraction of her gift. Songs like "I Will Always Love You," "Greatest Love of All," and "I Wanna Dance with Somebody" are timeless classics that will be played and loved for as long as music exists. Donald Trump, for all his complicated feelings about Whitney's choices and her fate, never wavered in his assessment of her talent. He consistently called her voice the greatest he had ever heard, and he meant it. That Whitney squandered so much of her potential made her story sadder, but it didn't diminish the incredible heights she had reached during her peak years. The wedding that Trump attended in 1992 represented a turning point, the moment when Whitney Houston chose a path that would ultimately lead to her destruction. Trump had recognized it at the time, had felt the unease that comes from watching someone make a terrible mistake, and had been powerless to prevent what followed. In the end, Whitney's story became a lesson about the importance of choosing your partners wisely, surrounding yourself with people who build you up rather than tear you down, and having the strength to walk away from relationships that are destroying you. These were lessons that Whitney learned too late, paid for with her voice, her career, and ultimately her life. Donald Trump, standing in that purple-decorated mansion on a warm July night in 1992, had seen the tragedy coming but could only watch as it unfolded over 2 decades. The voice that had been the greatest he ever heard was silenced far too soon, and the warning signs had been there from the very beginning for anyone willing to see them.